meeting. I just wanted to quickly just tell you all how important you all are, this group is, this issue is, to the Denver Foundation. Climate issues are now among our core issue areas of focus at the Denver Foundation. That's as a result of our strategic framework that we adopted like 2 years ago. I'd like to recognize our board chair, who helped steward that process, John Lowy, who's also a member of the group, as you all know. So yeah, as a result, we've been really busy working on sustainable solutions for a more sustainable and resilient Colorado. And we've broken that up into 3 main buckets. One is grant making, which you traditionally think of as a foundation function and a community foundation function. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The other is policy. And then lastly is through our investments, how we invest our corpus and the decisions that our investment committee and our board makes with respect to that. But a quick aside, last week I was in Colorado Springs for the Philanthropy Southwest Conference. And I spoke on a panel on climate issues. I was the only foundation. There were a couple of environmental nonprofits, actually 3 of them, including the Nature Conservancy, who spoke. But the audience was mostly foundation folks. So I took the opportunity to talk about the need for philanthropy to be bold in the space, to overcome some of the natural hesitancy that boards perhaps might throw up. In the case of the Denver Foundation or other community foundations, that donors might throw up, because this issue unfortunately has become so politicized and so divisive. You get a hard stop oftentimes before you can even proceed with a conversation about a foundation taking on environmental and climate issues. And so I was trying to give those in the room a little bit of encouragement, and I think everybody understands the gravity of the situation. The question is, can philanthropy step up in a meaningful way? And I think there's an obligation for all of us to do so. So that's why this partnership means so much to the Denver Foundation. And I hope that you all will continue to help guide and support the work that we're doing in addition to this partnership to move on. So I mentioned the 3 places where we're trying to move forward at the Denver Foundation on environmental issues. On the grant-making side, I'll tell you about a couple of funds that we grant the money out at our discretion. One is the Critical Needs Fund, which was highly active during COVID, but also comes into play during moments of crisis. Increasingly, those moments of crisis deal with environmental calamity catastrophes, such as the Marshall Fire. We deployed resources out of the Critical Needs Fund when that tragedy occurred just up the street from us. So that's one resource that we have. The other is our big grant-making program. This is the money that we invest in the community every year out of our endowment called the Fund for Denver. And as I mentioned, because now climate issues are part of our strategic framework, we are starting to make grants in the environmental space as well out of these unrestricted assets. So this cycle, the Community Grants Program, we had around 12-13% of our total grant making out of that program that went to environmental nonprofits. There's also a considerable amount of donor-advised activity in the environmental space. Many of you support and fuel that activity. In 2021, $4 million of our staff grant-making, donor-advised fund grant-making was dedicated to environmental issues. On the policy front, the framework again highlighted the need for the Denver Foundation to be active in policy and advocacy efforts. So we've been very involved at the state legislature with regards to issues, again, that align with our core issues of focus. That includes climate and things like housing, transportation, et cetera. So we were very active in this last session on bills related to transportation access, air quality, those types of measures, oftentimes locking arms with a number of our partners and friends in the environmental nonprofit community. We've also taken positions on ballot measures that hopefully all of you have voted or are about to vote on next week. Things like Waste No More, which we took a supportive position on Denver sidewalks, which we believe also contributes to better mobility throughout throughout the city and decreases, hopefully, car usage. And then lastly, on the investment side, which is a piece that I will tell you the board and staff are working incredibly hard on, because I mentioned the community grants program and the investment in environmental work. Well, our grant making payout rate is 4.5%. So the question that we're asking ourselves is, what about the other 95.5%? Well, that's invested. And so we need to look very closely at what that investment portfolio is doing and whether it's in alignment with the goals that we're trying to achieve on the policy side, on the grant making side, et cetera, rather than perhaps working at cross purposes to those goals. And conversation that has been happening in universities and in foundations now for a few years, and that has resulted in this wave of ESG conscious investing, and we certainly have ESG metrics that we apply on all of our investment decisions. But the last thing that I'll say on this is that the reason we're working so hard on this issue is because we're not satisfied that we can drop the mic by just pointing to our ESG scores. I don't believe, and I don't want to sort of create a bit of a kerfuffle here, but I don't believe that ESG is sufficient. And I think our board and our investment committee agrees with that. We need to be more intentional to ensure that beyond ESG, we're absolutely in alignment with mission and values and helping to drive impact in these core areas. That's probably a topic that we could spend a couple of hours on, so I'm just going to close right there. And again, just thank you all so much for your support. We are hard at work throughout the organization. One other initiative that we have is with the Colorado Health Institute, and indicators report data measuring the impacts to human health of the climate crisis. That report will be coming out soon. It's called Acclimate Colorado, and the hope is that from that data we'll be able to identify and drive policy solutions to help mitigate against some of those harmful effects on human health. Any questions before I hand them over to Jen? Great. Thank you all again so much. It really is awesome to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Javier. I'm Jenna Six. I'm one of the founding members of the Environmental Affinity Group. That's a group of donors, a lot of which have donor advised funds at the Denver Foundation that have been meeting now for 8 years to try to increase donors' awareness, interest in environmental issues, and then we do collective grant making. So this year we have a pool of funds, and we're right in the middle of a process to evaluate 22 proposals and see if we can give away the money to have a bigger impact than many of us can do alone. But the proposals are in the Denver area, and they run the gamut of climate issues, from building a pollinator trail to help community members understand the benefits of natural ecosystems, to operating a infrared FLIR camera so we can see oil and gas leaks. So they cover the gamut, and it's really hard to know which one is going to be the most impactful, affect the most people, help climate the most. The one issue that we've struggled with is, how do you communicate about climate? And Javier gave a great example by saying you bring up the subject and people just shut down. So that's why we're having this important discussion. I feel like the projects we're doing are good pilot projects, but they're not at the scale needed, and they're not really addressing the core issue that we need to look at to reach the scale and the urgency we have at hand. If we see climate in the news, it's usually about a natural disaster, maybe reported by Mike Nelson. And it's usually bleak and it's overwhelming. One last week in the Guardian newspapers reported on the new United Nations report, and it says the world is close to irreversible breakdown. What do you do with that? It doesn't give me hope, and I think we need hope. The Center for Effective Philanthropy has reported that climate funders and even non-climate funders think that the climate is an urgent issue and we need to have a role for philanthropists, but we don't really know where to plug in and what to do. So this is a call to action to mobilize philanthropists to do something about climate communication. And I have really big goals for this panel this morning, and I'm really hoping by the end of this hour we come up with the solutions. So we'll be talking about different ways to communicate and brainstorming how philanthropists can be involved. Our first guest is Mike Nelson, who's been the chief meteorologist for Denver 7 since 2004. In fact, Mike's been the chief meteorologist at 4 different stations since 1985. He's spoken to over 1 million children about climate and weather. That is so cool. And he released a book in 2020 called The World's Littlest Book on Climate, 10 Facts in 10 Minutes on CO2. So you should have some at your table. We have extras. Take any that you need so that you can become quickly informed on how to communicate about science. Excuse me, about climate. So Mike, what are the climate forecasts that you'd like to share with us, and how is climate currently being covered in the media?
Good morning. Almost afternoon. Nice to be with you today. When Jana invited me to come and do this, I said, well, how much time are you going to give me? And she said, 15 minutes. And I kind of paused and said, Jana, you know that after 45 years in TV, I'm pre-programmed to only talk for 3 minutes. So what we're doing, I'm going to do a 3-minute talk, and then we're going to have 12 minutes of political ads for you. You need more of that. So the climate emergency is our subject today. How can media coverage on climate be more effective? Here's how you can find me if you'd like to. And Jana was nice enough to mention the book. 2 things: you can scan this and get a free download, or you can take a picture of that and get a free download. Oftentimes I've been accused in the media of using the climate emergency to get money for my book. And, I don't make any money on the book. Any proceeds from this go to the Citizens Climate Lobby. The book was written by myself, Dr. Peter Tons up at NOAA, and Michael Banks, who is an environmental writer up in the Boulder area. And our idea was to, most people are not going to take the time to read Dr. Michael Mann's inch-thick book on climate, although it's excellent. But we're hoping that they might take 10 to 15 minutes to learn the basics by reading our little book. I want to start with the 7 deadly sins of climate change denial, which I have heard many of these over the years. You cannot even forecast next week, Mike Nelson. How can you forecast next century? Climate has always changed. Carbon dioxide is just a trace gas. Hey, back in the 70s, they said it was cooling. It's snowing in, fill in the blank, so therefore it cannot be getting hotter. It's too expensive to do anything about it, or you cannot trust the media and the scientists. Well, first of all, is it even in our area as television weather forecasters to talk about climate change? Our job is to be the nice, friendly person that people tune in and invite into their living room to tell them what it's going to be like over the weekend or for their child's wedding or whatever. But given the number of Americans that are skeptical, we need to get the proper science out to the public, and our strength is in that 3 minutes explaining something complicated, the weather, to an audience that is not scientifically literate necessarily, and do it in a somewhat entertaining and hopeful manner. So talking about climate change is something that I do, but I have to tell you, it is a market exclusive, which is usually a good thing in TV. Market exclusive tonight, only on Channel 7. I don't want to be the only one talking about climate change. I want all of the weathercasters in this market and all over the country to talk about it. Because we already do things like this. They might say, well, I'm not a climate scientist. How can I talk about climate change? Well, already the station comes to you and says, Mike, there's a meteor shower tonight. Can you talk about that in your weather report? Or there was an earthquake. Can you show us the map where that occurred? Or the volcano is erupting. Or there's a tsunami. We do this all the time. That's why we're called the station scientists. And so it behooves us to know enough about climate science to be able to talk about it to our audience. It's an opportunity and I think a responsibility. Because here we have the 3 frogs. And the one says we're slowly being cooked in a pot. And the other one says, no, we're slowly being boiled in a pot. And the denier says there's no consensus. We've got to use our megaphone to get the information out to the general public. Now, whenever I speak to a group, and I one time spoke downtown to the Petroleum Wives Club. Talk about a cold audience there. So I always mention that fossil fuel has been a miracle. Concentrated energy from the sun stored underground for millions of years. Its energy density is what makes it so useful. Life without fossil fuel is cold, dark, and short. But, you know, you light it on fire, it warms up the planet. When people say, well, why don't you go live in a hut with a candle? I always tell them that's a false choice. We don't have to live in a hut with a candle. We can still have a modern lifestyle without burning fossil fuels. So, very often the pollsters will ask people, I just saw this last night on the 4 hours of Fox, whatever you want to call it in the evening, because I try and watch both. What are you worried about? Well, people are worried about the economy, the cost of goods, national security, immigration, the war in Ukraine, other global conflicts, their kids' future. Look, at climate change is way down on the bottom. They're not worried about climate change. If you're worried about any of these, you are, of course, worried about climate change because it is a threat multiplier for every other thing we face. And ladies and gentlemen, we have to start worrying about what kind of world we're going to leave behind for Keith Richards. Keith Richards and cockroaches, that'll be it at the very end. So, here we go. How? You can't even predict next week. How can you predict climate? Well, climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. Climate is a long-term average. Weather is chaotic and it changes rapidly. You would expect that Miami would be warmer than Denver in February because the climate of Miami dictates that it would be. Now, you might plan your week to go down to Florida and a strong cold front moves through Florida and it's 55 degrees and raining in Miami where Max is up in Boulder and it's 65 with a Chinook wind. That doesn't mean the climate of Miami changed. You just picked a lousy week to go to Miami. So it's actually easier to predict climate than it is to predict the weather. It's basic thermodynamics. If you add heat to something, it gets warmer. It's by day, it's warmer than night, and summer is warmer than winter. An analogy I like to use, and feel free to steal any of this stuff when you're talking to people, weather is one play in a football game. Climate is the history of the National Football League. If it's snowing in Las Vegas, well, it's wintertime. We expect more unusual weather occurrences as the climate system gets more energy. Global warming creates a steroid effect. That's why I have Sosa and McGuire down here. I show that to kids. They don't know who those old men are. But the steroid effect makes droughts more extreme, or it adds moisture, increasing the intensity in a rain event. It's always changed, Mike Nelson. Yes. The fact that it's always changed is exactly why we know what's happening now. When people ask me, do you believe in climate change? I say, you can believe in the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy. I understand climate change. So we know we've been through ice ages. We understand continental drift. We understand we've been through mass extinctions before. And we know why. There's really only 3 reasons why. There's changes in the orbit, which drive us tipping slowly back and forth in and out of ice ages. We should be gradually going back into the next one now. Changes in the output of the sun, we can measure that very well, and changes in the atmospheric chemistry. And of those 3, only one is changing and changing rapidly, and that is the change in the atmospheric chemistry. Now at about 418 and change parts per million, goes up about 2 parts per billion every single day. As a matter of fact, the same amount, people say it's only 418 parts per million. How can that do anything? It's a trace gas. Well, that same amount of a trace gas, if it was carbon monoxide in the air right now, would leave us unconscious and close to death. Now, carbon dioxide is not poisonous, but it's very effective at redirecting heat and making things get warmer. So the key thing there is small amounts matter. You know, that tiny little COVID virus is not very big, but boy, that small thing sure mattered in the last couple of years. And think about this. We're rapidly changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. The carbon deposits of oil, coal, and natural gas that we're burning were deposited in the Earth's sediments over the last 300 million years, or 3 million centuries. And so, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have released that back into the atmosphere in less than 3 centuries. A huge and rapid change. And the rate, sadly, is not shrinking, it's growing. We can identify the chemical flavor, the isotope. We talk about this in the World Wilderness Book on Climate, so we know it's not from volcanoes or other sources. And did you know, every single day we're adding 100 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Every single day. And it sticks around for a long time. The carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for centuries, the residence time. As a matter of fact, the CO2 emitted from the first Model T car is still in the atmosphere, causing the Earth to warm. Oh, this is all since Al Gore. No, this goes way back. Joseph Fourier, 1825, realized the Earth is too far away from the sun to be as warm as it is. It was the atmosphere trapping the heat. When Abraham Lincoln was president in 1863, John Tyndall, an Irish chemist, identified carbon dioxide as the gas that was absorbing the long wave or Earth energy. And Arrhenius, in 1895, estimated that a doubling of global CO2 would warm the Earth by several degrees, the warmest at the polar regions. And ladies, in 1856, Eunice Foote, an American scientist at a time that women certainly were not scientists, placed jars of different gases in the sunlight, and the jar filled with carbon dioxide warmed up the most. Let's hear it for Eunice.
Yeah.
So it's not good. I met Al Gore here in Denver. But it's not because I met Al Gore once that I understand climate change. I just know that it is not political, and without the greenhouse effect, the Earth would be 60 degrees colder. But it's too much of a good thing. Each doubling of CO2 increases the energy retention of the atmosphere by about 3.7 watts per square meter. Now that's about the same as an old-fashioned non-LED Christmas light or a child's nightlight. So the entire surface of the planet is a huge amount of energy. And the forcing from that doubling is about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. It's usually best to not use Celsius when talking to an American crowd because they spend too much time trying to do the calculation. Over the entire Earth, and the melting of the ice caps could raise the sea level 5 to 10 feet in the next century. And we know it's getting hotter. It's not just that we understand global warming because it's hot lately. It's because we understand how it works. But yes, it is getting hotter. We see all of the latest in just the past decade or two of the hottest global years, the global temperature, the snowpack decreasing. Things are getting more and more stressed, and it's getting drier. Remember that drought is not just a lack of rainfall. As temperatures go up, you get greater evaporation. So with increased evaporation, you get more drought. And we know the terrible water crisis that we face across the West. This was just 3 straight years along the Front Range, from fires to floods, drought. Everything is going to be made more extreme as the planet gets more energy. What does that mean as far as Colorado? Well, lower water, basic things. It's a lot tougher if you're in a rafting business when the rivers are low. Earlier melting out for the ski areas, and they all have to have snowmaking because it's 70 degrees today on the first day of November. It's going to change the flowers and the fauna that make our state so great. All of that is going to move uphill as things get warmer, and certainly major wildlife concerns as well. And flooding becomes a greater risk across the east, while we get greater and greater worries from flooding in the west. 40 million people alone live in California, depend upon all of that water. Beetle kill, we've certainly seen that go rampant through the state of Colorado. Coral bleaching, not as big a concern that we see every day in Colorado, since there's no oceans, but you've seen it across the world. And the changes in agricultural concerns as the pests move into different directions and get more and more prevalent. This is from the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. Decreased crop production, our food supply is going to be impacted. You're seeing this on the Mississippi River right now with the extremely low water levels that they can't bring the normal tonnage on barges, and toxic blooms of red tide. And greater infectious disease concerns worldwide. Rising temperatures, rainfall, floods, all of these things will create more of a problem with disease. The third world does the least to contribute to global warming, but they are impacted the greatest by it. Take a second for this one again from the toolkit here. Heat-related illnesses, cardiovascular problems from extreme heat, environmental degradation, health impacts, malnutrition. We have diseases like cholera, respiratory illnesses, malaria, dengue fever, Lyme disease, all of these impacted by a warming world. And more stress on our infrastructure, more power outages have been across you saw the thing that happened in Texas. That was from a cold wave, but it was because of something called Arctic amplification, which changed the way the jet stream moved around. It seems kind of counterintuitive to say, well, global warming calls the cold wave, but again, things become more extreme. How about this for Denver? By the time my grandchildren are in their 40s, if we keep going at the rates that we are on carbon emissions, we will have a climate here like that of Amarillo, Texas. Now, I have a friend that lives in Amarillo. It seems like a nice town, but it certainly is very, very different looking than Denver, and by 2100, it'll be like that of northern Mexico. Imagine 100-degree temperatures up in Estes Park at Rocky Mountain National Park by the end of this century. So look at this. When I first moved here 30 years ago, the realtor said, do you want to put in air conditioning in your house? A lot of people don't. I said, I think we'll just put it in. Nobody asks you that anymore because we're looking now at about 5 days of 100 or greater. We're looking at 20 days by 2060 and 40 days by 2100. How about the Thwaites Glacier? You think we have refugee problems now? 500 million people live within 10 feet of sea level. If that thing breaks off into the ocean and the sea level rapidly rises, we're going to have a whole lot of people going for higher ground. And the warming is baked in, but it's never too late to stop making things worse. I mentioned that residence time, it's going to be around for a while. We have already had 5 great extinctions. The greatest, 252 million years ago, is when the volcanoes burned the Siberian traps and released massive amounts of CO2, went up to about 6,000 parts per million. 90% of all the life on Earth perished. Well, right now, we are doing that about 300 times faster than we did for the Great Dying. And the last one, the dinosaurs couldn't stop it, but we can stop this because we can actually fix this. Right now, a lot of it's baked in, so we have all of these things that we can do to kind of help us mitigate, but we can also power forward by making our political leaders aware and getting new laws. This is where foundations like this will go a long ways. We can make all of these changes. Some people say, what about the other countries? Well, they are making the changes. Do we want to continue to eat China's lunch on this stuff? No, we want to be ahead of it. And again, the third world can improve greatly just with a little bit of wind and solar compared to what we have in our areas here. We can really change their lives greatly. Many great jobs in renewable energy. Look at these changes we've made in storage for computers and air quality. Well, we're still doing energy the same way. I mean, computers used to fill a room. They don't anymore. And when people say, that electric car, that gets it from coal, even then, an electric car is way more efficient than a gasoline-powered car. And the automakers get this. Right now, if you look at all of these numbers, I added them all up from 7 of the major car manufacturers. They are pouring money into electrifying their fleets, over $320 billion, because they don't want to be the last manufacturer making a horse and buggy, because they know they'll be out of business. This is how fast it can change. This is New York City, Easter Sunday, 1900. Right there is the one car. 13 years later, right there is the one horse and buggy. When you look at what they're doing in California, by 2035, you have to be all off of new electric or gasoline-powered vehicles. We're going to do this because the oil age is going to come to an end. The Stone Age didn't end for lack of stone. The oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil. I put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I have a few more slides, but it's time to run some commercials. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been great to be here. We can do this. We can do this. Get it ahead to the next speaker.
Sure. Boy, it's hard to say stop because that is so interesting. And Mike, I really appreciate you working on the slides because you have a lot of new information that I didn't see before. Telling it like it is. Thank you.
Is that something you'd be willing to post on the Denver Foundation website, the access to your presentation?
Sure.
We'll try to work on that.
On this thing, please take whatever I do and use it wherever you can.
So Mike talked a lot about the science of what's going on. He mentioned 418 parts per million, 100 million tons of CO2 added to the atmosphere every day. It's really hard to visualize, hard to grasp. How do you get your neighbor to care about that? We have someone who's been researching effective communication as a profession. Dr. Max Boykoff is the chair and professor in environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's researching effective methods and messages about climate. He even wrote a book on the subject, Creative Climate Communications. Thank you, Mike, for displaying the book. Among Max's many activities, he was a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 6th Assessment Report, and possibly more. He was an advisor to the film Don't Look Up. And he also leads the Media and Climate Change Observatory, MECO. One of his projects, I think through MECO, is working with comedians. How can you get more people talking about climate? So Max, please come up and pick up where Mike left off about how climate's being covered in the Colorado media, how effective is it in creating behavior change, and what kind of messages would work.
Okay, thank you so much, Jenna, for that kind introduction. I'm going to do my best. Mike, thank you. I mean, it's an honor to be with you all today, honored to be able to speak on this panel with such an amazing communicator around climate and weather and other scientific topics. So I understand my role here today is to talk a little bit about some of the research, some of the work that we do to better understand how media are covering climate change and what might we do better. And so the first prompt that I got from Jenna was around this about the problem. How is climate change currently covered in Colorado media or media generally? I'm going to put this all up here because I want to go with this. How effective is current media coverage in creating behavior change? I'm going to get to these considerations with the time that I've got. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock too for you, Jenna. And then I'll talk a little bit about the project inside the greenhouse where we're doing comedy and climate change as a vehicle for communication. First with this group, the Media and Climate Change Observatory. It was a group that I started when I was at the University of Oxford, my previous job before coming here to Colorado. We work with a big team, and I'm going to just share with you the credits momentarily, just to demonstrate that pretty much all the work that I do now in this research space is collaborative. That as Mike and I work in the same spirit. Take everything, run with it. There's only so much any one of us can do. And so I get together in teams and blend expertise and perspectives so that we can carry out as much as we possibly can. So this project is one that has grown since my time there. It's now roughly 130 sources across largely newspapers, but also radio and television, where we track media coverage of climate change or global warming monthly in 14 languages in these various places around the world. I invite you to go to our website. If you just Google Media and Climate Change Observatory, you should probably find it. I'll talk a little bit about this Inside the Greenhouse project, and I'm not going to mention so much our local science engagement network here today, but it's all within this new group that we have, Creative Climate Communication and Behavior Change. So it speaks to the question, how does media coverage create behavior change? It's a very complicated answer. I can give you a very long answer to that, but keeping it short, I'll try and provide a few comments here with you all. So here is our team. Again, it's not to overwhelm you with names here, but it's to demonstrate, again, that I'm one of many of us who are working across all these different time zones and languages, where we sync up. Essentially, the mechanics of it is the third day of the month, we track the media coverage from the previous month. Shortly thereafter, put out a summary. We upload our data sets to an open access place through CU Library so that people can grab them. There's 25 data sets. There's 15 figures that we have, different regional takes. This is global newspaper coverage. We have all of these that are available for you to download. You can zoom in. There are interactive features on our website. Because essentially that group of us know that even though we have built up a pretty significant team, that we still can only do so much. And so to further our work, we make this available, and we're really pleased to see that it gets used in a variety of ways. And I'll touch on that in just a minute. And so we can certainly, if you want to, in the discussion, get into some of the reasons behind these. This is COVID here, and how there are these increases and decreases. Suffice to say that we end up tracking this across these 5 themes. Political, as you can see, economic, scientific, ecological, meteorological, and cultural. So I just want to further emphasize a point, though, that Mike had made, is that climate change is not a single issue, not an environmental issue alone. That this threads through all the different ways in which we live, work, play, relax, pray together in society. And so there is not going to be a single issue Democratic National Committee decision about whether or not this gets discussed in the next upcoming presidential election. This is tapped into in all of these different ways. And so I can give you many examples. This is how we track it month to month in terms of political actors. We've got the UN climate talks coming up. I'll be participating in that in Egypt, where we're going to have Joe Biden speaking on November 11th. there raising attention through his political pronouncements. The economics of this, decarbonization is not a politicized issue. It's a reason why I'm doing my evening MBA actually, is to continue to build a skill set with these changing conditions. Scientific, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, other scientific papers that end up influencing media coverage of climate change, as Mike had talked about, or Janet talked about as well, some of the devastating ecological or meteorological events as they're related to a changing climate. And finally, culture. I'll give you one example. How many of you, raise your hand, have not heard about tomato soup and mashed potatoes thrown on our artwork in the last couple of weeks? Okay, a couple hands. But most of you have. Raise your hand if you have. Okay. So this is a news story that's really traveled through the cultural sphere. In fact, I was on NPR and almost considered on Friday talking about this. And so this is an example of the cultural dimensions of issues like this that get raised and carried through media sources all the time. So these are some of our summaries. We've been tracking it now across 5 years of annual reports, and month to month. We're on issue 70 that's going to be coming out. This was our last, again, tapping into ecological or meteorological events, the devastation in Pakistan, which drove significant media coverage in September. And we then take these data as a foundation for work that we can do. I just share with you the transition, semi-peaceful transition of power. You can see that in September 2020, you can see these are word clouds, which many of you may be familiar with. This word frequency associated with climate change news coverage. The words get bigger. You can see it recedes, and Biden is emerging here. Trump goes from second most invoked term along with climate change coverage in the fall of 2020 to the 72nd in this particular month. So we use these data to help us better understand patterns, to help analyze how effective media are covering climate change in some ways too. And so that's brought me to writing a lot about it. I see that as a good part of my job. And so I do that dutifully, writing posts too and stuff like that. But it gets at hopefully contributing positively and productively in these ways. I just want to highlight one with a short bit of time that we've got that is open access, if you want to take a look at this. Part of the story here, if I can tell it quickly, is that my older brother, who's a political science professor at Pacific University near Portland, Oregon, he and I were just having a conversation as two graduate students. I was working on my PhD in environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And we were having a conversation, what are some of the things that trip up media coverage of climate change? This had sort of built upon, actually previous to this, I was working in the Peace Corps in the late 90s in Honduras when a Hurricane 5, Category 5 hurricane tore through the region where I lived. Tremendously devastating. Hurricane Mitch is what it was called. And I was really fascinated by the contrasts at times between news accounts and my own firsthand experience going through it. A lot of the news accounts were caught in the capital cities, understandably. We can talk about the political economics of all that. But then my brother and I were having a conversation, how can we start to systematically take a look at this? So we looked at 5 newspapers and basically looked at how these 5 U.S. newspapers covered human contributions to climate change. As Mike had made the point well, that there is this convergent agreement among relevant experts that humans contribute to climate change, as seen through these IPCC reports and in other places. And so we did this study, and we actually found that 53% of news coverage from 88 to 2002 had actually been skewed away from accurate reporting. And so we found this really curious. And we ended up attributing this to the journalistic norm of balanced reporting at the time. And then argued that it perpetrated an informational bias upon those who were consuming these media. Got picked up in Al Gore's Film and Inconvenient Truth. We got a lot more attention than we were ready for. But it led me down this set of questions. There are many of them. And so it also led me to this increasing feeling. So we published a paper in 2004 on this subject. And even like this week gets cited. And it started, I really enjoy that my work is resonant and is useful, don't get me wrong. But that people hang current arguments on data that were gathered from 1988 to 2002 increasingly troubled me. And so this is a collaboration of my own students at the time. It took us 2.5 years, so everyone's out doing other things now, actually. But we ended up saying, all right, we're going to update these data, and we're actually going to expand it out into other English-speaking countries. And so this is the study that we did. Lucy McAllister became lead author. She put in a lot of work. She's an assistant professor at Denison University. And it's a way that I was able to train students, again, in the spirit of just trying to help us do more effective work. And so a few findings that I want to highlight for you. I know Janet warned me about it. Okay, I'll wrap up. This is showing that accuracies increased, actually. That is a good news story, that accuracies increased. Is it 100%? No. So there's still work to do. And over here across sources, very briefly, not all sources fared the same. We analyzed, and I can get into the details there, with coding, almost 5,000 articles. You can see that some fared better, some fared worse, and some of this maps onto the ideological spectrum. I'll leave that up to you to start to pick it apart. Some of the Rupert Murdoch-owned News Corps sources didn't fare as well. We didn't go in having that sense at all. So to wrap up, honoring Jana's signal, we have a lot of engagements that are going on. Our work gets picked up in places like the Florida Senate. We're happy about that. We want to keep pushing forward. Very briefly, I'll mention the book, which integrates these lessons. And really one of the take-home points in terms of solutions, and maybe I can talk about this more in discussion, there's no silver bullet to this stuff. It is about Mike speaking to school groups over and over as they rack up and helping activate and inspire young people. It's about all of these different ways in which we communicate. In Chapter 7 of the book that you kindly held up, I do arrive at some tenets and some bits of guidance through the social sciences and humanities scholarship that we can actually start to say what's working, how, when, why, under what circumstances. It's led us into these spaces of comedy. This is a theater professor, Beth Osnes, with whom I collaborate quite a lot. And it's led us into these places where we also activate University of Colorado students so they can find confidence as they gain competence in these areas as well. So I'll wrap up by just asking these two basic questions. And in the interest of time, the answers are no and yes.
I feel bad, Max, because you have so much more to share. Each one of those is very rich. So we are going to have time for a conversation with everybody and questions and comments from you as well. So now let's talk with Stewart Vanderwilt. Stewart is the CEO of Colorado Public Radio since 2018. He worked in public radio before that in Austin and in Indianapolis, or Indiana. So he's a veteran at communication for public audiences. While he was at CPR just this short time, he's already raised funds and created a climate media program. So I look forward to him talking about that and how it's worked. How effective is the current coverage, and what are they covering, and how does it all make a difference? And then would you talk for a minute too about what people might be thinking about for philanthropy?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's
Thank you.
been just really inspiring for, good. Now I know how to clicker works. Really inspiring for us, and see some supporters here for our work, and we appreciate that, and the work of the foundation. So the question, how could media coverage of climate be more effective? So I have three things. More coverage, directed to a general audience, connecting with people's everyday experience, and focused on solutions. Something that conservative columnist Brett Stevens wrote about in the New York Times this past weekend. Janet talked about this at the start, and that she's looking for solutions from this conversation. And so I'm going to illustrate that some. Here's our approach. CPR, as you mentioned, we actually have one of the largest journalism teams dedicated to climate reporting within a daily news organization. I'd say largest between the two coasts. LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post have larger teams than us. And then there's specialty publications that have teams that are dedicated to climate coverage, but within a daily news organization, we've made a major investment here. Having a dedicated team has benefits in a number of ways. One, we develop subject matter expertise that each team member is able to go deep in certain areas, do training, and become experts in and of themselves. You see Michael Elizabeth Sakis, who covers water and agriculture, Nate Miner, transportation. That's Joe Wirtz, who's the managing editor of this team, who puts a solutions focus onto everything they do. Miguel Latorla, who focuses on equity and social justice. And Sam Brash, who does sustainable building, wildfires, and has somehow become an expert on wolves. Sam, whenever he does a story about wolves, if we just want clicks, we just write about wolves. It goes crazy. But what we're going to talk about is sort of our approach, and it's based in research that some 40% of U.S. adults don't trust national news. However, if you do stories about solutions, particularly local solutions, the trust level goes way up. So that's where we focus. There's other research that's also shown that people's knowledge and beliefs are perishable. That they may read, hear something, it connects with them, they believe in it, but then they hear something else that sways them another way. And so we see that it's really important that we cover this every single day. Not a story here, not a story there, but actually to make this a through line of all that we do. We have 3 through lines in our coverage: equity, social justice, and climate. You will hear those themes when we're doing a business story, when we're doing an education story, an art story. And we do standalone climate stories, but we also cover climate inside of other coverage that we do, whether it's politics, business, the arts. So just some examples of how this plays out. This is a story about Rangeley, Colorado. And the premise of the story is this is a community built on coal mining. What happens when coal goes away? What's going on in Rangeley is they're working on what they call above-the-ground solutions. And they're looking at the arts and outdoor recreation as an economic solution to a change in their fundamental economy. One thing I suggest you Google and look up is something called the Tank Center for Sonic Arts, where they've taken a water treatment storage tank and turned it into a sonic experience. I mean, just think of what a tank sounds like and go in there and experience a concert. This is a creative solution to a fundamental change in their economy. Dr. Max talked about, and Mike about the spread of diseases related to climate change. Colorado saw a significant increase in West Nile virus cases this past summer, connected to a warmer, moister climate. Saw more hospitalizations and more deaths to West Nile than has been previously seen in our state. And this is one of the results, but in this story was also solutions. One of the solutions, DEET. Don't get bit by mosquitoes. And then there's policy and politics. The legislature put $2.5 million into looking at the disparate impacts of pollution on low-income communities, has created a database where you can go and look at any particular county and see how much at risk that people are in that county for adverse health effects based on pollution. And what you'll see, poorer counties, much more at risk across Colorado. This is early in this, and we'll continue to report on it. There's not yet a lot of solutions, but knowing the data is the first step towards identifying solutions. And then let's just talk a moment about wildfires. Wildfires have become more intense. We've moved from wildfire seasons to wildfire years. At CPR, with a combination of our climate team and our investigative reporting team, we looked at 18 years of wildfire data across 11 states to look to see if there was any patterns, and particularly how Colorado addresses wildfires. Here's what we found, that Colorado, among these 11 western states, is dead last in identifying the actual cause of the fire. Most fires are human-started, but Colorado is absolutely the worst at identifying the human who started it and how. And part of that is because we invest money in fighting wildfires. We don't invest money in identifying how they got started. This led to legislation to put more money into investigations. That failed, but at least it's a start in the conversation. And here's a story about Science Moms. Science Moms is an organization of scientists who are also moms, who are working together to develop ways to talk to kids about climate change. Two of the Science Moms are in Colorado, and this is a story about the work that they're doing and the impact that they're having. Just a couple more slides, and then I'll get to some suggestions. As I said earlier, there was 3 things that I think that the media can do. 1 is more coverage. 2, for a general audience. 3, focused on solutions. When we produce more stories, it has more reach. If we did a story every other month, that story would probably be heard by some people, shared by a few, but by the fact that we're doing stories every single day, those stories are finding their way into media across the world, reaching millions of people, not only in Colorado, but in publications throughout the world. And we also take and I'll borrow a term from transportation, a multimodal approach to producing and delivering stories. Upper left, an e-newsletter, podcast, a ghost train about the train that didn't get built between Denver and Boulder. And on the right, we call this experiential reporting. On the right, that's Sam Brash again. He's building an analog beaver dam in the Calwood burn scar. Calwood suffered a major fire in 2020. We took a group of volunteers to Calwood to build these beaver dams. The purpose of these analog beaver dams is to slow the runoff of water in order to help revegetate the site. And by building these dams, it helps the sites come back sooner. But experiencing that in person, both our reporters, but also the people who we brought along, helps people understand both the impact of climate change and also solutions to how we can repair. So finally, in the area of investments, I would make 3 suggestions. The first would be, for impact, I would suggest investing in organizations with a sustained and wide commitment and significant reach. There's where you're going to get the most out of investing in future coverage. Second, I would invest in broad areas of coverage, which enables producers to identify and produce stories with an audience-centered approach versus a very narrow topic approach. An exception from this might be a beat focused on an existential issue of a very specific region. For example, workforce or economic transition in an area like Rangeley. But ideally, you invest in broad areas of coverage because that's going to reach most people. And third, to get a little more specific, capacity building within producing organizations. Even with a large team like we had at CPR, resources are always constrained. And CPR, like most producers, and this isn't just about us, could always invest more in travel, in training, in convening, and outreach. And it feels a little oxymoronic to invest money in travel to cover climate, but you got to go there. You got to go to where the story is. You need to experience it firsthand and talk to people who are living it. And so we're sending our reporters around the state and sometimes beyond this state to look for solutions that can be reported back to Colorado. And then I want to point to the right side of the screen. This isn't actually about climate change, but with actually funds from the Denver Foundation, we invested in translating our entire voter's guide during this election into Spanish. And if we had just translated it into Spanish and put it on the CPR website, it's unlikely it was going to break through and reach the intended voters. And so we used funds to buy billboards in targeted communities to direct people to this coverage. We bought ads on Spanish language radio and social media. It's important that when we do this work, that we also take the next step and promote it out to audiences that we may not be serving on our own channels. So think about investments, see if any of those categories make sense for you. Thank you. Oh, and bees. I gotta say something about bees. So having a climate team, resident within CPR, is a real privilege because we have a team that talks to us as an organization about the importance of climate and the decisions that we're making within our organization. And so when we decided to put bees on our roof, it was the climate team that did the presentation at the all-staff meeting about the important role that pollinators have in our community. And having done that, a year from now will be when we probably get our first harvest. We'll probably have enough honey to give a jar of honey to every person at CPR. But every person who gets that jar of honey is going to have a better understanding of how important these bees are to our community. So thank you.
Thank you, Stewart. I'm honored to be up here with all of you. Thank you for your thoughts. And if you're chomping at the bit to speak up, now's the chance to do that. And by the way, we have a lot of food left, and we have birthday cake over here because today is Max Boykoff's birthday. Cake to celebrate Max. We've heard about climate change is happening. It's real. It's human caused. There are things we can do to stop it. We have a role. All right, how are we going to communicate that? What are the essential messages? What thoughts do you have or questions or reactions? And I'll let the speakers go first if you had a quick comment on anybody else's presentation or have another comment to add.
In that chart that you showed of, I would say, newspapers who are kind of getting it right, on the far left, was that the ones that were most accurate?
Yes.
Well, I was glad to see the Toronto Star there.
Yeah.
Having grown up in Canada, I just wanted to put a shout out for Canadian news media.
Yeah.
What was the spike in 2010?
Yep.
And then everything kind of went back down.
So there's not all news is good news, as you all know well, I'm sure. The Copenhagen set of climate talks is a short answer. Top 15, as it was called. Obama had just been voted into office. There was a great deal of anticipation about him saving the next round of negotiations. That was preceded just slightly by university. It was 2009 into 2010. In 2009 was the Copenhagen talks. 2009, just before the talks, was University of East Anglia email hacking scandal that some called ClimateGate. And so that generated a lot of news coverage. So it looks a little bit like 2010, but it was actually the end of 2009. Yeah.
I'll be interested to monitor how much coverage the new climate talks are going to get in Egypt. Is that next week?
It
That you're
starts, yeah.
That was
And,
interesting that you identified, sorry,
Go ahead.
that you identified sort of the false equivalency of, on one hand, people say this, and on the other hand, people say that, and how that sort of set, I guess you could say, set back the coverage for a period of time.
Yeah.
Do you feel that's mostly changed?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in that in the legacy traditional newspapers in particular that we covered, yes. No, in that the media landscape has changed dramatically since that period of time, as you all know well too. And so the ways in which we get caught up in these echo chambers through social media and through other news outlets that didn't exist before, that's the no part, is that it's really hard to pin that down.
Ouch. John, did you have a comment?
Yes, a well-known fact that we all that follow climate know pretty well is that 97% of climate scientists believe in effect, anthropologic climate change. And since we have a very prominent meteorologist in the room, I know I read some years ago, I haven't seen it recently, that among meteorologists, the percentage was much lower. I remember I saw, I don't know how many years ago, it was like 50%. And I just wanted to ask you, Mike, what's the explanation for that? Where does it stand today?
It's frustrating. I really am the only broadcast, and I'll say meteorologist, but we have about 50% on the air here in the Denver area, which is stunning to me because we have NCAR and NOAA, and we have CSU, we have all these great research facilities, and only about 50% of the people that do weather on TV really have a great deal of knowledge about it. And I think that there's a couple of things going on there. One, television weathercasters tend to be a little bit of an arrogant group, and they think that they're smarter than other people. It's like dealing with physicists or engineers. Geez, that's out of her heart. Try and talk to some of them about climate change. But, and I think the other part is that, you know, I'm about twice as old as any of the other ones that are on the air here, with a few exceptions. And for me, if I talk about climate change on TV, and I will always get a couple of really nasty emails. There you go, politicizing the weather report again. I'm going to watch somebody else. And they always will copy that to your general manager and your news director to make sure that, you know, they do as much damage as they can. I don't care. I mean, I've got the confidence and the backing of my news director. But if I'm 30 years old and I've been in Denver for 2 years and I've got 2 little kids and I'm not that well known, you know, I do like weekend mornings or something, and I start talking about climate change and somebody sends an email to my boss saying, I'm not going to watch your station anymore because this person's doing that, that's bullying, first of all. But it's also daunting because you're like, geez, I got to keep my job. You know, maybe I should back off on that. So part of what we're trying to do is inspire and encourage the younger weathercasters to be okay about talking about it. Case in point, when we had the heat wave this summer, and I'd see it up on the split screens of all the other stations, and every one of the weather people up there's got, this is the 33rd day of 90 or hotter. And they just go on to, you know, look at this cute picture that we got. And it's like, make the connection right there. It doesn't take very long. You can slip it in really quick and say, you know, the reason that we're seeing it so much hotter now is because the years are getting hotter because of the increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Boom. Wouldn't that take me 10 seconds to say that? That's all you got to do is slip that in. You're not saying, so vote blue or whatever. You just you're giving them the science. And I think that part of it is that they're just reluctant to stir up the little hornet's nest because they know that some people will write back and be negative. But I would tell you, I get 9 out of 10 of the responses I get when I talk about climate change on the air are people saying thank you for talking about it. You're the only one that makes the connection. So.
Good point.
Some years ago, building on John's question, you floored me when you said that people who present weather on TV, that maybe half of them are meteorologists, and 30% of them deny climate.
Yeah.
So the point that really stuck with me was science versus, I think you call them generously weather people, or actors.
Those people are friends of mine. So. I refer to them, I am a meteorologist, but there are meteorologists. You know, it's a visual medium. I mean, if somebody is a pleasant person to look at, they'll get the nod to get the job. And you know, that's kind of the way that it works. But it doesn't mean they can't also talk about it. And across the country, in many, many markets, we have at least 1 or 2 meteorologists that are pretty vocal about it. And I'm a past chair of the American Meteorological Society's Station Scientist Committee. And that's about 10 of us broadcast Mets that are on the committee that try and encourage younger Mets and, or any of them really to talk about climate change more. And some of it's giving them the talking points. You know, you can lay something out there that's like, you know, the climate is the history of the National Football League. And that's like, oh, that's an analogy I can understand. So you try and give them some talking points that way. Yeah.
I'd like Max to add a little more about the conversation on how we just need to talk more about climate change. You mentioned that more meteorologists need to be talking about it. You said we need more coverage. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing to have everyday comedians talk about climate change?
Yeah, sure, and I can build on Stewart's comment about more media coverage coming too as part of the public conversation. So, yeah, I mean, the idea being that there's not a silver bullet, there's no one thing that's going to get everybody talking, there's no one thing that's going to resonate or motivate people to act. In fact, the tomato soup and mashed potatoes can actually have a lot of people, you know, actually finding that not to be effective. But that's conversations. In Boulder County, I haven't looked in Denver lately, but in Boulder County, 47% of adults occasionally talk about climate change or global warming with friends or family. That's not so good. And so we've been doing several things. Comedy is one. We've had a partnership going with a comedian, Chuck Nice, who's co-host of Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's helped bridge into professional comedian spaces. One of the things about COVID, there are very few things to look to in terms of silver lining, but underemployed comedians joined us in the Zoom space, and we started to build writers' rooms with our students and created a ton of really interesting content. And so we tethered it to this project called Project Drawdown, so they were focused in on solutions, again, to your point. And so it's generated and seeded these spaces through comedy to meet people where they are more effectively. I will just say at the end of your presentation, too, we've moved into advertising. As you mentioned, as you put up the billboard. Starting November 9th, if anyone's in the Boulder area, some of the buses coming down to Denver, too. We have a big bus pro-climate action and engagement campaign going. That's going to launch the day after the election because it's City of Boulder and Boulder County funds for the first wave that will hopefully get people talking. In a second wave that we're calling it, that'll hopefully go up by November 30th. We're still trying to raise funds for that. We're partnering with Yale University and George Mason University. You may be familiar with some of their polling. That's where the 47% comes from. And so we're using some of their findings and their polling numbers, and we're just going to plaster them up on 76% of Boulder County residents feel corporations ought to do more about climate change. What do you think? We're trying to generate through advertising these conversations. So those are a few examples of what we're experimenting with, but there needs to be a lot more.
Yes. Hi, Melissa.
Hi. So as a kind of half half of my life is in the journalism world, half's in the communications world. It strikes me that a lot of the discussion and the strategies that you're talking about, like framing and how to reach audiences where they are, I mean, they could really benefit from the connection of some of these two worlds. So I'm just wondering, like, for example, Stewart, you guys have this amazing team and it's doing, cranking out daily wonderful work. Are you thinking at all about like how to get that out beyond just the CPR listenership? And I hear your billboards and things like that. That's wonderful to hear about. But are you thinking about communication strategies or even how to like use your team to help educate some of the other, and I heard, knowledge gaps in some other journalists. Are there ways that you might be thinking about to leverage the amazing team you have,
Yeah,
to
so our climate team is the only TikTok team within CPR as well. So, they're taking some of their reporting and making ticks or talks, I'm not sure. Making those things. And so we're trying a lot of different things like that. We did a climate change variety hour, not well attended, but the idea was to take entertainment and build a show around climate. Probably the part of it that got the most engagement was climate confessions, and one I remember was I put the pizza box in the recycling. Is that bad? And so then we had someone from CU Boulder who was on this, doing the, sort of doing the answers of the climate confessions. By the way, if you tear the greasy part off, you can probably recycle the other part of it. So yeah, we're trying, we're trying these different things, but it does take a certain amount of capacity to be able to, like do your daily work and then do one more thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so our team is really like, what is that one more thing that we can effectively do?
Mm-hmm.
So these are just some examples.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we need media training? Do we need to educate more people that work in the media about climate issues?
Yeah.
Yeah. AJ?
It seems that there are a couple of things converging. One, which worries me greatly, which is the headwind against science. And it underlays everything. And so if I were to do a campaign, I would run concurrently some sort of campaign that elevates the value of science in our lives, and how it amazes me that we bash environmentalists and people over the head, but they're the same people who are same science brains, the doctors by our side, solving our heart issues and cancer issues and all sorts of things. When the doctor comes to me and says, you have this heart issue and you need to do X, Y, Z, and you can't eat like this, and you have to run, you have to exercise, I don't take a 2x4 and hit them in the head. But for some reason, we take the 2x4 theoretically and hit a lot of the environmentalists and the purveyors of science in the head. So it needs, I think, the idea of rebranding and rethinking. I love the station scientists, as you know. It elevates it. And 85% of people tune into local news for
The weather.
the weather. And the most trusted people in the news are the weathercasters. So great purveyors. Say it ain't true, say it ain't true. So anyway, I see a layer of facing science and out to the public in maybe a different way, even as we concurrently talk about climate. And I guess my point to you, sir, and the whole group here, the multimodal, multifaceted part of all of those communications, doing the billboards, the TikToks, and everything, and kind of managing the conversation or orchestrating the conversation in a way that they're all working together. From the little local news, little ads in local newspapers and conversations. I think we could do a whole lot better job. But I love what you're doing on NPR. There's a knitting process. I think you were getting to that because we're kind of at that level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Pre-COVID, we had a seminar. We brought in Scott Denning from Colorado State, Kevin Trenberth from NCAR, and had it open for all the broadcast meteorologists in Colorado, not just Denver, but all the markets over at Metro State. We're going to do another one now as we're coming out of COVID, probably sometime in early 2023, like Saturday morning, and just do a seminar for the weathercasters. Because I think a lot of it is, if you haven't really had the time to dig in and learn enough, you're a little reluctant to talk about it. And we want to give them the tools. But one thing that you can also do is, surprisingly, even now, TV station management responds to letters, whether they be email or handwritten. And you can urge people to write to the other TV stations, say, you know, how come you guys don't talk about climate change in your weather reports? I guess we'll have to watch the guy over on Channel 7 because he does. And sometimes that works a little bit better than you think. It always has. And they may go to a meeting and say, why don't we talk about climate change? We're doing it across the street. So.
I would completely agree that a bit of coordination goes a really long way. As it relates to, say, the advertising, for instance, what we're doing can be transferable to other communities. What we're doing can continue. We're really just in a pilot phase to see what resonates. We have QR codes with each advert, so we're going to do research to see how it's working so that we can further tune in. But I think your point is well made.
Max, the thing I've wondered too is maybe we ought to be, in front of like the RTNDA, the Radio TV News Directors Association, because do a session at one of their meetings about climate communication. If we could get more of the news departments on board, as important as their investigative department, maybe we should really have them talking about climate a lot. You've had good response in the public radio scheme, but if we get this more out there, because the national media is not doing it enough either. You got different levels. I was surprised to see that, I think it was CNN was better than most, if I was looking at the graph correctly.
Yeah, yep, that's true, but there's such a long way to still go. Yeah. So I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I would just, when you guys are such leaders, in the field, I would encourage you to do that. Because, like one of the things we funded through Gates was a water fellowship where we brought, some really experienced, really good water reporters who could, mentor hyperlocal newspaper reporters who are like generalists and they don't have any time to learn about the intricacies of water. And they aren't going to listen to us from the foundation, but they will listen to their peers who are really good at covering. And so, that's the type of, thing that I think we as funders should think about is like how to really elevate the, influence of folks that are covering it well and help them help their peers. So I'm thinking about models like that.
That's helpful. Melissa Davis is with the Gates Family Foundation and also started the Colorado Media Project, which is helping
with
local
a lot of
news.
other people.
Yeah, it's helping. We're almost out of time, so let's keep talking about next steps or what your interests are. Any last thoughts?
I think Stewart should interview Mike on CPR.
Well,
Weekly.
Ryan does that.
Yeah.
We put that to the professionals. Yes, we do.
We do.
How are you on, Mike?
Once a month I'm on the morning Colorado Matters with Brian Warner. We talk weather and climate. And our next one is next week, Monday or Tuesday, I believe. And we're talking about the new weather station that's being just about to be deployed out at the exact site, the exact same location that the weather observations were taken for Stapleton Airport for 70 years. That all got moved out to DIA 25 years ago. We lost that particular link to the past climate, but through some philanthropy, we were able to buy a complete weather station and get it all installed at no cost to the taxpayers. And it'll be right at that exact site, putting the thread back together.
So there's a promo for Colorado Matters.
Yes, Mike.
Yeah, so Mike, Colorado's doing a number of things there are a number of things being done in this state right now which are really cutting edge and trying to make Colorado sort of a beacon to the rest of the country. John Powers and I and a bunch of other people working on one that I think is going to have huge reach, and it happens to be focused on democracy, protecting, promoting, et cetera. I think you have a really interesting opportunity when you bring those weather people together that you just referred to sort of paint a similar picture to them and say that Colorado, as the state is, or people in the state are doing in other specific areas, Colorado has an opportunity to be a leader in exposing climate and climate discussion to the rest of the country. I came here the same as you 30 years ago, and I've watched tremendous change in this state, going from red to blue politically, et cetera. And it's really clear to me that this state has a unique platform and podium to deliver a message that is found to be credible, if for no other reason than we're in the middle of the country. We're not on one of the coasts. We're not viewed as being as biased as, let's say, people are on the coast and institutions are on the coast. So I would encourage you, when you bring those people together, to say to them, we have a real opportunity here to take a leading role.
Let's make it all happen. I'm personally interested in climate communications, so if you have ideas, please feel free to get in touch with me, jana6@gmail.com. And to all the speakers, please keep in touch so we can try to put some of these ideas into action. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I?
Yes.
One round of applause. I didn't get a chance to meet you all from the Denver Foundation, but I also want to give a round of applause to the Environmental Affinity Group and really Jana, who helped take the lead on creating this amazing event. So, anybody out, but two things: we will recycle your name tags. We will make sure that we share out Mike's presentation. We also recorded this, so this will be available and can be shared out with everybody that was here today. And please fill out our survey that's on the table. We always try to be a learning organization, so please let us know what you thought. But no need to rush anybody out. There's lots of cake left, so I'm sure it takes some.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Jana.
you.